All right, we are live. Don't have any viewers yet.
We'll give it a couple of minutes.
Sounds good. And then we can start. Let's see if I can neatly.
You can hear us.
All right, whenever you're ready, Robin, I think we're good to go.
Welcome, everyone, to the Virtual Summer Institute on Evidence-Based Use of Small Unmanned Aerial Systems for Hurricanes. This is being sponsored by the Center for Robot-Assisted Search and Rescue, and there are two primary members, the Humanitarian Robotics and AI Lab at Texas A&M and the Center for Disaster Risk Policy at Florida State University. And the funding for this is part of an NSF RAPID grant. And of course, we all know that anything you like about this presentation and the data sets that we're making public, great. Give NSF full credit. If there's anything you don't like or there are errors that we make or anything like that, don't blame National Science Foundation. It's really on us. So let's get started. Let's just look and just think a little bit about what we mean by small unmanned aerial systems. And here's a view from Hurricane Harvey.
The Center for Robot-Assisted Search and Rescue at Texas A&M's Engineering Experiment Station has been working with Fort Bend County Office of Emergency Management to provide small unmanned systems, aerial vehicles, and even marine vehicles to be looking at the underneath bridges and the river. What we've been doing is providing small unmanned aerial systems primarily to give aerial imagery so that the officials can see what they're doing to make real-time decisions.
We believe this is the largest formal deployment by public officials of small unmanned aircraft systems for disaster response in our nation's history. These drone platforms working from different elevations have provided our local emergency management team with aerial photography in multiple scales and in high resolution. We have the ability to adjust unmanned aircraft flights in real time to assist with search and rescue operations or changing flood conditions. The teams were comprised of federal, state, and private organizations and agencies from across the United States, all working together to help the citizens of Fort Bend County, Texas.
So that gives you a little bit of an overview of just Hurricane Harvey and the use of small unmanned aerial systems. And then think about even more so at IRMA. So we've got a large data set, and the objectives of this Virtual Summer Institute is to see how you can access and use those data sets. And in particular, we're going to go through what's contained in the Harvey and Irma data sets, what can be used, how it's set up. We also want to go through what's already been learned from the data about small unmanned aerial systems, anywhere from performance, platforms, human-robot interaction. And so we'll present the results of the analyses that we've conducted to date. And then as a community of scientists and technologists, what is the type of data we'd like to get in the future? It may not be possible to get it, but if we don't start thinking about what is useful to us, we'll never get it. And so those are the objectives for us for today. Our agenda is as follows, and the modules will start at the scheduled time. So if something runs short, that's a great time to have a break. So we're starting off with the welcome, review of disasters, objectives, definitions all together. Then at 12:30, we will start with a tour of the Harvey data website. Then we'll ask questions of that, and so that'll be about 20 minutes. We'll do likewise with the IRMA website. Questions is, what about the data? So it's mostly what we're focusing on first is here's the data, here's how it's organized, here's what you can find on it, and how can you navigate it, and that's what the question should be related to that. Then we're going to talk about what we've learned so far, what our analyses are, and then what questions you have about what are these summary findings. And then we'll shift to talking about the data science and just feedback on the website and suggestions for improvement, of which I'm sure there are numerous. But let's get started talking about definitions and useful background materials with ARMA. Harvey and Irma. So what did we have to do with that? We keep saying this term, the Center for Robot-Assisted Search and Rescue. Well, CRASAR has been around since 2001. It used to be hosted by Texas A&M through 2017, and in 2018, this year, we became a nonprofit. Florida State University, their Center for Disaster Risk Policy, is a member. CRASAR technically led the Harvey response with Florida State as a major participant, and then Florida State, the Center for Disaster Risk Policy, led the IRMA response, and all the other CRASAR members were participating, including Texas A&M. And then Dave Merrick, who's director of the Center for Disaster Risk Policy, and myself put together an NSF Rapid Collaborative to publish the data sets. One reason, and I'll explain why in a minute, but anyway, so you also, Justin Adams, who's president of CRASAR now, was also the person who directed the Harvey flights and the effort there. David Merrick directed the IRMA flights. And one of the reasons why we're really passionate about trying to get this data out, besides the fact that we want the data out, is that it was great to have funding to try to sort through it, because we've been to, I think, 13, 14 different disasters. We're not even showing going to the, responding to the Kilauea volcanic eruption a couple of weeks ago. So what we know from the past, it's really, we've got a lot of data, but it's hard to organize it for anybody who wasn't there to figure out what's available, what imagery is available, what video, what robots were used for what. And that's what we're trying to do here. It'll be very helpful to think about what this data means to you when it was collected. It was collected during the initial response and restoration reconstruction effort. So the initial response and restoration. And that has some nuances that many people I don't think are aware of. So if you think about post events, one way, there's lots of taxonomies, but a common standard taxonomy in emergency management is to say there's this initial response phase, all life-saving, immediate mitigation of any hazards. You try to start turning the power back on, you fix the roads, then you're starting to reconstruct and get people back in. And then, everybody's trying to get their houses fixed, and then you're actually trying to improve things, change your policies on floodplains and building and that. So that really interesting part that you think of the disaster will last anywhere from about 3 days to 3 weeks. What's interesting from a UAV perspective is that only professionals are allowed at these initial phases at the beginning. I mean, the agencies, the public safety agencies, are trying to evacuate the citizens. They've restricted many times the airspace because they have helicopters flying low, trying to do lifting of people off of roofs or emergency evacuations, and that's incredibly dangerous, so they restrict the airspace. The government agencies have the right to go stand in somebody's front yard. They can, that right of access is a big deal. They are also the people who are the agencies who are doing this are using very specialized expertise. They're structural engineers, drainage engineers, emergency managers that are trained in the public good, and they also have high public accountability. Then later on, As this goes on, people are allowed to move back into their houses, the reentry. At that point, at some point, the government no longer has the right of access. Right? So you think about it as I'm searching for a missing person. At some point, that missing person search, you're not allowed, even if you're a fire department or law enforcement, to just go on somebody's property and say, well, I'm still looking for this person. So same thing with a disaster. And you see the shift to citizens being the individual decision makers versus an agency being a decision maker. And a lot of this is influenced by public policy. For us, what's important to keep in mind is that relief and humanitarian is this later phase, but also that our data sets, CRASAR is fairly unique in that we really don't do relief or classically called humanitarian missions. We are there with the professional responders assisting those agencies in that very unique time of which they have direct control and are trying to do life-saving and mitigation efforts. And also, if you want, there's a lot more about this. There's a webinar, Computing for Disasters, that was put out in February of this year. Okay, another thing that I'd like you to be aware of is that these talks and these analyses that we provide are going to all be using kind of what we call an all hazards approach. And that means we're not looking so much as, well, flooding is different than wilderness, is that they actually have commonalities. All of these different types of disasters have commonalities. And so far, we've found that there are 7 mission types. So this is our taxonomy. We have 7 mission types. And then as we go forward, as you'll see that we've subdivided these mission types into primary objectives. This is a very cluttered slide. PowerPoint was not working with me on this taxonomy. I apologize for it, but if you see the mission types, you can see that they've gotten subdivided into mission objectives. So for instance, a strategic situational awareness recon survey, you would have one specifically just to get general situational awareness. Another mission objective within that larger mission type would be to provide public information. Another might be to provide mapping. So we do have this taxonomy, and we'll be referring to that throughout this throughout the data sets. And do keep in mind that for us, mapping is defined as the production of orthomosaic or other photogrammetric products. Oh, I'm out here mapping something. Well, often people use that to say, I am out here flying, trying to figure out what the situation is. And we're going to use survey to refer to that, which is a manual or ad hoc exploration, versus mapping, where the UAV is going click, 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 click to get images that overlap that can be put into a meta view. And that gets us to the data products, which are, we've got still imagery. We'll talk about how we didn't use thermal and these other things. They weren't needed. It's all visual. Standalone, either the imagery was used because you just wanted to take the picture, that the expert needed the picture, or because it was an input to photogrammetric software, which is usually taking or pointing straight down. We also have video, and then we also, a data product is the photogrammetric products themselves. And I just want to throw in a little reminder here, is that there are the differences between Harvey and Katrina, the use of small UAS. Katrina was the first use of small unmanned aerial systems. And the difference in use cases are surprisingly small. So there's a lot of discussion about, well, there's nothing been written down. Well, I would encourage you to go back and look at Chapter 4 on unmanned aerial systems in MIT Press, disaster robotics, because that data is still there, still good to go.
All right, it is 12:30 Central, 1:30 Eastern. We are ready to get started again here. So, Odair, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Odair Fernandez. So I'm going to give you a tour over the Harvey Dataset website. As you know, the URL is atrail.crasar.org. So in the main page, if you're not logged in, you're going to see you have the About Us page, which you have access to the video that we just showed at the beginning, and a summary of the deployment in the Eastern area. You also have access to the our analytics paper. So if you click on this link here, bolded, it's going to take you straight to our technical report, and you have also access to that. Then after you was from this page, you also have access to all the locations, the 56 locations that were with the deployments, with the addresses on that, so you can have an idea where were the flights at. But to actually have access to the full data set, you have to register. So you can either go to Hurricane Harvey Data, and it's gonna ask you to log in or register. Once you registered, you will have access to the full data set. As you can see here, you have two types of views. You can view the main data set, which you can view the main attributes of the missions or sorties, or daily data set, which you can view the missions or sorties by each day. Let's start, and also here we have access to a quick summary. This summary just tells how many sorties flights were deployed, number of missions, number of platforms, and data products, things like that. So let's start by main data set. So if you click on main data set, you can then select to view by mission or by sortie. Let's just start by sortie. And you have everything, all the sorties listed. You can also change the number of entries. So you have all the flights that we've deployed. And if you want to have access to the data product, you just have to click on the name, and it will tell you a short summary, and then you have the options to download it. So let's just give an option. You can download, and of course you're gonna have to agree to the terms and conditions. So once you click on the agree, you can download the data products for that specific sortie. So that's one type of view. You can also do by mission. The only difference is by mission, there are some missions that have multiple sorties, and as you can see here, let me make it bigger. So for example, all these first missions have just one sortie, but there are a few that, for example, this one that has two sorties. So when you click on it, it's going to take you to that mission page, which just lists which missions were there, and the data size, the capacity of the data that was generated, and the total flight duration for that mission. And again, you have the access to each individual data products for those flights in that mission. Going back, let's go back. So that's for by mission, by sortie. And again, here you also have the full data set that you can download. We have an Excel version, a CSV version. So the same thing, you just download it. You have to agree again. And then you're going to have access to the mission name. You have the sortie numbers, the sortie ID. The only difference between the mission name and sortie ID is that mission is just the general name. And then, for example, here you can see that each sortie has a different number. So every name here in sortie ID is going to be unique. So here you have one, and then you have two. You also have access to the response phase that we were at. So we have, which were four. We have before, incident, response, and recovery time. You also have access to mission data size, mission type, and primary objectives. You can also know if there are pictures, videos of photogrammetric products in each of the flights. Number of pictures, videos, platforms, platform type, control. We have FPV and PP. FPV stands for first person view, and PAs pre-programmed. We also have mission flight duration. So this is the combination of the time of the flight duration for the entire mission. So for example, you can see here for the flight. So this sum would be, it's this one. You also have information about our pilots, start time, day, geolocation, and distance in miles. This distance is from the Fort Bend County office. Then let's go back. So we also have a CSV version of it. Going back more. So this was the main data set. So you also have access to the daily data set, which just allows you to select, let's do by mission, just allows you to select by each day which one. So for example, let's pick September 4th. You have only the flights that are on those on that day, and again you have access to the data products for that specific flight. And again, you just have to click download and then agree to the terms. To mention as well, let's go back and try just one. Let's do on the 3rd. You also have, let's pick, for example, this one that has 23 sorties inside it. Yeah, you can see all the sorties that belong to that mission and type, and also, of course, you have the search bar, which you can just locate. Let's see, for example, well, they have the same thing: inspection, every dam. But then you'd be able to sort by pilot, by time, anything, just using the search bar. And that will cover the data. In the account, of course, once you register, you just allows you to put a picture or change your password or delete your account if necessary. You can always contact us if needed, and that will be it. While we are waiting for some questions, we can also, when you're not registered, you have access to this data set overview, which it's limited, but you only have access to the sortie ID, mission type, primary objectives. You can see if there are images, videos, or photogrammetrics, platform, and control only. You also have access to the summary, which we showed a little bit ago. And it shows, if you go down, if you scroll down, that in order to view the extra attributes, you'd have to register with us. So, and you can click here to register or log in if you already have an account. And again, you can search for a specific, let's say, platform, all the ones that only have Mavic. Let's make this a bit bigger. So it only shows you the ones that have the Mavic platform.
Okay, so we did have one question come in. Just want to cover that, make sure. Will a recording of this be available? And yes, as soon as this webinar is over, this URL will link you back to a recording of this, and then we will post a cleaned up version with all the gaps and breaks in the middle for everyone to take a look at. All right, we had another question come in regarding how the photogrammetry data was generated. Was it from a commercial software or open source libraries, and how accurate are they? So that's going to vary. The accuracy question is going to vary from dataset to dataset, frankly, and what altitude we were flying at. You're going to see accuracy anywhere from about 2.6 centimeters per pixel up to 4.5 or 5 centimeters per pixel, again, depending on the altitude and the specific sensor we were flying at that point in time. All of the photogrammetry data was processed in Pix4D or Agisoft PhotoScan, one of those two on a computer or laptop in the field. So we didn't use any open source software, nor did we use any cloud-based or internet-based services to process that information. I've got one last question here. Will we publish the data regarding the UAV platform during the data collection, such as GPS IMU data? We don't have any telemetry data specifically from the aircraft. We used a majority of the things we flew were DJI products, and they actually make a lot of that information very difficult to get to. So no, short answer there. We won't have any specific IMU telemetry coming off of the aircraft available because, frankly, we don't have it. So the next section we're going to go to on schedule here is an overview of the CDRP ARMA UAS data, which is actually going to feel an awful lot or very similar to what we just saw regarding the A-Trail and the Harvey data. So I'm going to turn it over now to Laura Hart, who's going to start walking through there. And then I'll come back and go into a little more detail on the data sets.
Hello, everyone. My name is Laura Hart, and I work at the Center for Disaster Risk Policy. So first, our dataset for IRMA is located at cdrp.crazar.org, and that is the IRMA Small UAS dataset. So upon opening that page, if you go to the main page, the home page, you can see the main dataset description, basically stating that there are over 50 gigabytes of damage-related images and video within this dataset. So then you can click on the dataset overview on the top portion of the page, and that will show you more again about the actual mechanics of the dataset itself. So similar to A-Trails, you can see that we've got mission name, number of sorties, mission type, primary objective, secondary objective, sortie ID, products, pilots, all sorts of different variables that distinguish each specific mission. Within that data set, you can see that mission names kind of cascade by date in terms of that deployment during Hurricane Irma. There's also a sortie ID for each individual sortie, and missions are also separated by data product in terms of still images, video, or photogrammetric products. So in order to access this data, you can simply select request access to this data on most of the web pages and also on the top bar. And if you click on that page, it'll prompt you to basically state your name, job title, affiliation, email, kind of general demographics, and then once you submit that, you will gain access to this data.
Thanks, Laura. So our data, all of the IRMA data is currently housed in a Google Drive. And once we receive and process your request for information or for access to it, we're going to give you access to what I pretty much have up on my screen right now for you to look at. And so we went at this from a slightly different way, isn't it? We started with the imagery and the video data that was collected and worked backward from there. So there are several tabs in this data set here. Excuse me. And I'm going to start here on the IRMA master tab, which starts with in the folder name here, and it actually lists, you'll see here in column D where we have file name, we actually have the individual images that were taken. So the first item we're looking at here is actually a mapping mission that we flew over Goodland, which was in Collier County. And so we have all of these individual images, which we later processed into the orthophoto, are available here. And we classified each image. Not only we have a link here to the actual image itself, but we classified the image by what airspace it was taken in, what environment, and probably most importantly for this is we classified it by mission type, primary and secondary objective, using the taxonomy that Dr. Murphy talked about at the beginning of this webinar. So we've classified every individual piece of media that we captured using that taxonomy, going through the entire 5 days that we were active during IRMA. So this is great. It's a lot of imagery, though, as you can see. So to give you something a little easier to grab, this is landfill, sortie 2 in Collier County, flew on 13 September. That was classified as inspection. We have our individual imageries, and we also have the movies that were taken. So a lot of the damage assessment work that we did, we would take oblique imagery from each of the 4 cardinal directions, as well as nadir vertical imagery directly over the point of interest. And if there was significant damage, we would fly a very short movie to kind of tell that story. And I use that phrase very deliberately about what was happened at that site. So again, for each of these, we have the environment was flown in, what classification of airspace, what authorization we were using, whether or not that was a COA, Part 107, et cetera, what the maximum altitude was, and terrain. So this is a lot of data. Again, each piece of imagery has an entry here. We also have a version of this where we color code the mission types, primary and secondary objectives. So again, you can get a visual idea of what some of these areas were. And then the third tab is where we kind of combined all that down into what we call ARMA Revised, where we drilled into the individual imagery and we combined it all together by sortie and by mission. So mission name is the first column here. That's going to be the key point for you. And it starts with a date code. So 09/13/2017, for example, here. And then we used an easy to understand name for what that mission was. And that a lot of that came from the critical infrastructure and key resources list that we were provided by Collier County. That overall was the majority of our mission there was inspection, damage estimation, and we were working off of, in conjunction with the county officials, we were working off of their critical infrastructure list. In other words, they handed us a list of about 1,100 targets and said, this is what that's important in the county. Go forth and image as much of it as you possibly can. So a lot of things like, let's see here, the East Naples Library, that could be done in a single sortie. So a sortie is a flight. Some of these required more than one. If we were going to map areas, we did have to often fly multiple sorties, so we break those up for you. So in the ARMA Revised now, instead of going by individual piece of media, we're going by the actual mission that we were tasked with. We classify that by image collection, video collection, or photogrammetric work. We tell you the number of photos that were taken to support that mission, airframe, as well as was it a pre-programmed mission or an FPV, very much like what Odera was talking about a few minutes ago. Duration in minutes, duration in decimal minutes, the crew that flew it, date, time. We also give you a link to the Google Drive folder that contains all of the imagery for that. So we're tying that back to the individual pieces there. We also have, we geolocated our launch point. So you have decimal latitude, longitude to look at where these flights were. And then we started doing some very basic analysis regarding how far were we from APF. That's Naples Airport. And that was our home base. So we were based out of a hangar that was donated to Krasar, an empty hangar on the airport. Of course, we didn't really fly at the airport, but we did sleep there. We did most of our data management there, and that became kind of our base of operations. Unfortunately for us, it's about a 15 or 20 minute drive to the county EOC, which is where the client was located and where we were working out of. So it added a little bit more compared to Harvey, where we were located in the EOC parking lot. Made that coordination piece a little bit easier, but we'll get to some of the findings later on. So we've got the distance from APF, so how far we had to travel in miles. The travel distance in meters here, that is of the aircraft during the flight. And then we also get travel distance in miles for the aircraft. Maximum speed, again, classification of airspace. A lot of Class Gulf airspace that we did have. Class Delta, we were working under 107 airspace waivers that were granted to us through the System Operations Support Center, the FAA, there in DC. Excuse me, and maximum altitude. So a lot of information here. You can download this as an Excel spreadsheet. You can of course work with it here in Google Sheets. Same thing. We do have some basic statistics set up for you, all ready to go, including by day, average distance, flight durations, things like that. One interesting thing is we pretty much flew all Mavics all the time in Harvey. We did have Inspire 1s. We had Parrot Disco FixedWings. We had 3ER Solos, an M600, all available. But frankly, for the types of work that we were doing, the Mavic did the job. And really, its biggest advantage was the fact that it is small. And since we were working off a target list of 1,000 critical infrastructure items, we ended up doing a lot of driving. So we would drive from point A to point B, get out of the car, fly the next sortie, 4 or 5 minutes, get back in the car or truck and drive to the next location. So again, all of this information is made available to you once you register and ask for permission to access it. Not doing that to be difficult, but it is a requirement again of the grant that funded all of this. So fill out that form on cdrp.crazar.org, and we will get you access to this as quickly as possible. Now, let's see. It is a little after 1:01 Central Time, 2:01 Eastern. Let's see where we are on the schedule here. We got about 10 minutes before we get into questions. We're supposed to be there at 1:10 or so. So that's fine. And then our next event is 1:20 will be the discussion of Harvey findings with Dr. Murphy. All right, welcome back. So it is now 1:20 Central, 2:20 Eastern. And our next segment here will be the Harvey findings and discussion with Dr. Murphy.
So let's go through some of the data that analysis that we've been able to conduct with a Hurricane Harvey data set. And I'm sure there is so much more to be done, but this at least gives you a start at what we've looked at and some of the things we think are interesting. So, and it's only a portion of the quantitative data that we collected, and it's focusing primarily on what was done for the preparedness and response phases. And it also doesn't cover some of the ethnographic data we collected about crewing and about airspace management. And those are very important as well. So it's kind of organized. We'll give an overview, talk about what small unmanned aerial systems were used for which missions, what platforms were used, and the recommendations for hurricanes and flood events. So overview. Okay, we flew for Hurricane Harvey for Fort Bend County Office of Emergency Management. And you can see that it's the large western suburb of Houston. Everything is bigger in Texas. It's a huge county. It has over where you see things like Sugar Land, that is very large classic subdivisions. So a lot of McMansions thrown in there for those in the United States. We know that term of very large, expensive houses. And then as you go out past Rosenberg to East Bernard, as you head west, it becomes much more agricultural and rural. So what's interesting about Fort Bend is the diversity of land use and population within one county. Some details about Hurricane Harvey. Of course, it's one of the most expensive hurricanes to ever hit the United States. And it was unusual in a hurricane because it wasn't the storm, the wind damage, it was water. It was flooding, both initially from the rain and then river flooding. So the hurricane moved east into the Houston area, and kind of hunkered down there, stayed there from August 27 to 28th. We started flying before, doing the before pictures, and then deployed as soon as the weather let up, and continued to fly until the evacuation orders were lifted. And it gets back to earlier in this, we talked about when the emergency is, when we've moved out of that initial response phase. We had 112 flights, which we will call sorties. And the star, whenever we use a star, that includes the one flight that was interrupted and had to be terminated because of a software glitch. We had 56 distinct missions that we were given to fly, and all the flight crews consisted of a 2 to 3 person pilot team, plus which had the 2 pilots plus a county expert. We always had someone from the county with us, and there are lots of reasons for that, but there is right now it was a huge amount of expertise that they needed to provide. They needed to see that information in real time. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We had 10 pilots who served as the pilot in command. We had 3 backup pilots. We also had 2 people who served as data managers. And so there. We used 9 different models. We had 14 models of unmanned aerial systems. We used 9 of them. We used the AirRobot 200, DJI Matic Pro, 600 Pro, Phantom 4, In Situ Scan Eagle, Intel Falcon 8, a Parrot Disco, Lancaster 5, 3DR Solo. And the workhorse you'll see will be the Mavic Pro for what we were doing. And we also had available thermal and multispectral packages. This flooding event did not require those. So the benefits of us doing this, of being there, Fort Bend County Office of Emergency Management said it enabled the rescue operations to be conducted faster, more efficiently, and more safely than if they didn't have unmanned aerial systems. The damage and the debris assessment were fast, allowed them, because they had that much faster, were able to restore services, contract for cleanup faster, and have overall faster economic recovery. They monitored the critical infrastructure, the bridges under flood loads and the levees. Positive economic impact from opening one of the bridges sooner, because we could confirm it had not been eroded, experienced erosion. Planning support from the data capture at certain river levels to understand what was going on with the river that runs through Fort Bend County. So it was as you had the rainfall and close to 50 inches of rain, and then you had flooding from the river as all of it was captured. The videos also helped deter citizens from trying to re-enter the neighborhoods that were dangerously flooded and filled with sewage. People were like, why am I out? Why can't I get back to my house? And it's like, well, look at the sewage, that yellow stuff floating on the water. That's it. And so Fort Bend was very aggressive in putting out all of the video from the small unmanned aerial systems that didn't have any PII, any personal identifiable information in it, and getting it out to the public so they would understand what was happening. And also it helped everyone in their government in the citizen support, the small UAS. They already had a small UAS program, and now they're able to expand it because everyone can see the value of it. So why would it be useful for first responders and scientists and technologists? Well, this is an interesting one because it was a record-setting number of flights and also a record-setting number of diversity of missions that was done for all the emergency support functions. You can look that up. In the United States, we divide the different areas into, like fire department, fire rescue types of stuff, medical types of support, critical infrastructure like transportation support, public works like sewage types of support, those things. The flights occurred before, during, and after. So they were very immediate. In a lot of cases, including our own, you see it's 3 days, 2 to 3 days after the event, and you've already entered the recovery period. Here we are clearly there before, clearly flying during, and clearly flying through that up into the recovery phase. Also, Fort Bend knew about small unmanned aerial systems. They own drones. They had used drones in 2 major federally declared disaster floods They knew about manpower, and they had a drone policy in place. The reason why they were there, they just didn't have enough people and drones to use, and they wanted to free up their experts to, instead of fly the drones, to be able to tell us to fly, look at the data, say, yeah, over there, left, no, okay, got it, and then go back and start calling in decisions, and we would be taking care of recharging batteries, putting stuff up, filing code, making sure that everything's all good. We also, was nice, is that this one, there was a wide, as you saw, 14 varieties of fixed wing rotorcraft assets and sensors. So you could choose from anything. The choice, what was used at Fort Bend for Harvey was because it was appropriate, not because we were trying to make do with what was available. And also what's interesting is all requests for air resources went through Fort Bend. So this was going through a centralized incident command, and air resources, was that going to be done by a manned system or an unmanned system? It wasn't an independent operation. And so this was everything here, and the positive results were by design, not by luck. So let's talk about the missions. I've already presented that, there's 7 mission types in general. There's the strategic situation awareness, reconnaissance, survey, the more the eyes on, the things you can get by looking at something, usually in real time. There's the detailed inspection or structural inspection that requires an expert to look at. There's ground search for missing person, water search for missing person, damage, debris, or flood estimation. There's tactical situation awareness, like if I'm a responder, there's a tree blocking this road, there's more trees behind it, or can I take this, is there a little cow path or game trail I can just walk around it? And we have seen delivery used in some events, but that's pretty ad hoc. So of those 7, there were 4 mission types that were used at Harvey, and like I indicated before with our taxonomy specific objectives. So there was debris damage flood estimation, and we saw within there mapping. So that is getting the orthomosaics, the photogrammetric products. There was visual assessment, where experts looked and what they saw was sufficient to their trained eye, that they didn't need to do any kind of additional assessment. There was also a tornado went through, and so assessing the tornado impact. Inspection was another mission, and in particular looking at bridges, at buildings, and at levees or dams. We also saw strategic situation awareness, reconnaissance survey, mapping, those types of missions, and we saw that for public information. And tactical situation awareness, we saw overwatch, where we were asked to help the responders see which way they were going and help give directions, and also route or transportation surveys. What routes are open, what are flooded, because the responders need to know the shortest way to get back to people. Now note that these missions, I'm going to highlight the ones that required real-time expertise, the ones that, hey, just because you're good at flying an unmanned aerial system, you would not have been effective because you don't know what they're looking for. And so with the debris damage and flood assessment, the visual assessment, we could have flown and taken pictures till the cows came home, as we say in Texas. But the value was the expert in drainage was there and could say, no, I need you to fly up. Something's wrong. Go look over here. Let's follow this creek up and look at this so I can see what's going on. And also being able to see the moving water. They can mentally do the calculations of how much, is that about the right amount of expected flow, volumetric flow of water. In inspection, bridge inspection and building inspection is not a matter of just getting pictures from all angles. I mean, there are things that can damage that you have to look up from a specific way to see. You have to get back in there. So we saw that. And also tactical situation awareness, and really required somebody who knew what they were looking for, thinking about in terms of routes and transportations. So notice that these flights really often required expertise, that it's not just being able to fly a UAV or pre-program a flight. There is an interaction and the decision-making process that involves a human. Now let's look at the missions by day, each day. You can see we arrived on the 25th. We flew 3 missions before, during the incident, before the rain got too bad, got some missions in to help establish what the state of the county was before. Then as you start seeing about the 31st, we began to fly more and more. And you can see, we'll start looking at these in a little bit more detail, but you can see you started out with the debris damage flood estimation, then switching to inspection missions. Later on, the strategic general survey, very late in the game, and that turned out that was for public information. And you see that recovery type of operations, tactical essay, showed up there started showing up during the recovery phase. So why did we have this part in the middle? Well, that was because the weather was so bad, and we could have flown UAVs. The 210 series is waterproof, right? We could see and keep visual line of sight, but there's FAA ceiling regulations that we've recommended that they relax under these conditions to let us, if it's not raining, it's, let's pop up and look around. So that was one thing we learned. Now notice again that the first 7 days, the missions were all oriented toward the real-time experts, the back in the office experts, and then no experts. So you're seeing a lot of that blue, and then going to yellow, and then you're going to the, in red, and then going to the green, to the general, to the public needing to see this. Even though the public they were posting it to the public as fast, they began directing the flights to better inform the public about what they were doing. Those were basically videography, pretty video runs. Okay, so isn't that interesting? The idea that expertise is the most important thing, that also has a lot of ramifications beyond on the informatics. The UAV isn't as important perhaps as getting the right data to the right person, and things like live streaming to the right person. Any type of augmentation of the data stream to help that expert becomes much more important when you look at data that way. We keep hearing lots that, oh, we just need situation awareness. The first thing you need after disaster is just to pop up and get situation awareness. We kind of see that as a myth because certainly Fort Bend could have done that. They whenever they wanted a UAV up, they had a specific reason for it. There was not just, oh, kind of, is there a flood? No, we know it's flooding, okay, but we need to know this part, this part, this part. So only the public information missions, the green ones, were general, and the rest were very, very focused. So that's interesting to see. Now let's talk about what platforms were used. So we kind of look at it this way, that you have basically about 4 tiers of altitudes. I know that kind of conflicts a little bit with how the military does it, but you kind of think of it, the smaller ones that are flying below 400 feet, the ones that really need to be 300 feet and higher, the fixed wings, and then you get into the bigger area of coverage that are still small unmanned aerial systems like ScanEagle. Okay, and so I've highlighted the ones that we had that we actually used. And you can see most of them were at the 400 feet, 200 feet in many cases because of the temporary flight restriction. Guess what? The DJI Matic Pro, one of the least expensive general purpose put in your pocket UAVs, was the most heavily used. Out of all the things we had there, it was used in 78 of the 112 sorties, and it was used for all mission types and produced data products, the images, the videos, and the maps. So that one, we say, look, if you've got a basic disaster, that's probably going to be your go-to platform. Now let's look at sorties by mission type. Most of the sorties were for inspection, and inspection of particular things. Levees and dams, now that number's a little bit misleading because that begins to get your mapping missions, which by definition take lots and lots of images and go over lots and lots of longer distances, so you get more sorties. But look at bridge inspection, very important. Building inspection, that was the jail. The county's responsible for that. They built it right next to a levee, and they needed to check on that as well. Debris, damage, flood estimation, which if you were like me, you probably would have thought that would have been your #1 mission type, turned out to be the second most frequent type with 39. Again, look at the visual assessment. They eyes on, that expert being able to look and say, yep, nope, I got it. And then mapping and the tornado impact. Strategic, we've already talked about the public information. The county judge who is in Texas, the county judge essentially runs the county in a disaster. So when and so the county judge had information meetings twice a day, once in the morning and once at night, and that would go across TV on all the public access and the news reports. And he would watch social media, and if anybody had a rumor or anything, we would be spun up to go up and get video to dispel that rumor or dispel that concern. And then we had tactical situation awareness. So that's the breakdown for that. Now, we had FixedWings and rotorcraft. Guess what? Rotorcraft was used exclusively for the response. We did not use FixedWing. We started using FixedWing for recovery. Recovery is like things have settled down. We now need to get a little bit more. You know, the responders are like, the county needs to understand more. So they started requesting doing things like inspecting the levees and doing these longer duration flights. So interesting, isn't it? But even so, we did a lot of that with rotorcraft. And this FixedWing have problems in when you're talking about the difficulties of finding a place to take off and land that doesn't have water. I know a lot of people, you think, there's a lot of soccer fields in the suburban area. They are, but a lot of them were built in the floodplains and using that public and parkland as a secondary runoff area. So they were flooded. So that was kind of an interesting assumption. You always think you've got space, but you don't. Also, look at the amount of flying and the frequency of flying that was in first-person view. It was until the recovery ops were requested. Look at that. We are flying. And again, it's not because we don't have the pre-program, we don't have Ground Station Pro, we don't have all these other programs to do. Everybody wanted to look and then say, go over there, look over there, do that. Our experts wanted us to be in first-person view. All right, and so again, to just reiterate, the responders were looking at the small unmanned aerial systems for rapid decision-making. And they had shorter flights. We'll see in a little bit that they had short flights. I'll know it when I see it. They would see it, and then they would just walk off back to the truck and start phoning in what they wanted, back at the center of operations to do, and they've made their decision. Okay, the op tempo is so intense, and you'll see that our travel times were so long that the idea that while you're there, just take another 20 minutes and go do a classic orthomosaic mapping mission. You'd think that we could have gotten a twofer while you're there, just go ahead and map it out. Nope, that's not time effective. It's like get in the car and go to the next place as fast as you can. You've got this list of missions to do. You don't really have time to do any extra while you're there type of missions. The hover and watch video was needed to estimate flow rates, and that's something you don't get from a fixed wing. It's very hard to just hover and watch and say, okay, yep, that's how it's flying. Also, Fort Bend County, the orthomosaics are big. They're hard to email or transfer, so it didn't really make sense to have them. You really couldn't share them. What instead they wanted was just a nice single picture that was more transportable, and you had that. We had, as I've already alluded to, we had extremely limited takeoff and landing zones. Really confined spaces where you're basically got a very narrow piece of area, to stand in next to a telephone pole, power lines, a fence, and and it's very, very difficult. And we were generally flying at 200 feet above ground level, although that did depend. There were a couple of flights we could do differently. And oops, I gotta say. Now, let's talk about duration. I indicated that they were short flights. The first person view sorties the mission average was about 9 minutes per sortie. And some of them required 2 flights, and you would see an average of about 13 minutes per mission. So now this number's low because some of these we did not get the actual takeoff and landing times. But even if you look at that, and we're just doing the timestamp of the first and last data product, even if you add in a couple of minutes for takeoff and landing, you're still looking at flights that were running about 12 minutes. We weren't exceeding the battery capability of something like a Mavic Pro. It's the get up there, you see it, and now you're down and you're on to the next mission. So that's kind of interesting. And we saw that back in Katrina as well. Another thing with the duration of the sorties, if you start looking at the data, you can infer that the experts are capturing less than 70% of the actual sortie time. So if you look at the known sorties and the estimated times there, the estimated is the times that they are capturing the data products are much shorter than the actual flight time. And that makes sense, right? You don't need to know why. I need to look at taking off and landing why. I just need it when you get over something interesting. But that means that we need that experts may not be the best use of their time to fly. If they're only using a small portion of the flight is valuable to them, why make them learn to fly? Why make them drive the robot? Why try to do it? Instead, how do we get them to have live streaming? How do we snippet just the part that's valuable to them? How do we give them data tools to annotate, prioritize, say, I need to route this to so-and-so in the main office to go look at further? That becomes much more important than trying to make these UAVs so simple that the experts can fly them, because it's not a good use of their time to fly them. It's a great use of their time to use the data from them. Also, back to the op-tempo, missions were in a 20-mile radius. So it's something like 19.9 miles straight line radius, which is not a straight line. You can see from the little red pins, there's not always roads back there, and certainly not main ones, and most of the roads were flooded. So we were talking 2 to 4 hours to reach a mission location sometimes. And it was very helpful also to have an expert because they knew the area. They knew the backwoods, and oh, if you just cut across here, we can probably get up to high ground there and stuff. Data products. So we talked about that, they needed rapid decision making. So we're talking about real-time video and images, the hover and watch, and the orthomosaics were kind of problematic. Now looking at the data products for the experts, let's look at images compared to videos by mission and phases. So if you look at that, you're starting to see that before you're getting a lot of your missions are on the tornado, the tornado impact coming through there. And then you're seeing during the response phase, you're seeing a lot with the debris and damage there. So there's a lot of pictures coming in for debris and damage. Less so with inspection. Even though there were more flights done for inspection, there was more images that came out for the debris and flood estimation. Now, if you look at videos, it reverses. Video begins to add value for inspection and, somewhat valuable for flood estimation. And then, you're seeing that for videos, again, for that strategic recon, that was really for public information. That was what is called those videographer runs. The pretty pictures to show that, yes, your neighborhood is flooded. There's raw sewage. There's dead deer floating. There's the top, that shiny thing that you're seeing in the water is the top of a truck. So you're not going to walk back or drive back to your house. This is why we have the evacuation orders still in effect. So those flights, that made sense they were video because they're just pretty videos, right? Is what you're trying to do. And then Overwatch was also video. So our conclusions, is you're thinking, Pictures are going to be before, and that makes sense because before the disaster happens, you just want some things you can blow up and put on the wall to think about what it looked before. You would never go back and try to compare video to video. How would you register it? And then pictures and video for the response. And then later on, mapping. Once everything's under control, you're out of the life-saving and mitigation. Now let's go back and methodically map the state of the county. Right? Another important thing, getting back to the informatics, is that the GIS branch, so every disaster or emergency will have someone who's handling the geographical information systems. They are never underworked. They are always working at capacity. And so saying, hey, look, why don't you go figure out all this UAV data and cut it into snippets and route it for everybody and put little pins on the map so we can see where it was and all of that. And by the way, you need find a terabyte drive, extra terabyte drive to put all this on. That's not going to happen. So we wound up with 148 gigabytes of data, and 84 of that, 85 gigabytes, came just from the Mavics alone. And us trying to handle and filter it for them required a dedicated data manager. You're talking about you want to immediately back up the data because ever since the very first use of a robot in disaster, there's always a possibility that you'll lose data. So you back it up, you have to rename it because having 84 gigabytes of image 001, image 002 is not helpful, right? Every run gets renamed that. It needs to be renamed something useful, annotated. Some things are like, oh no, this is the one where the structure was on fire. We need to tell the fire department about that. Or this is the one where there's water coming over the bridge, that sort of thing. Which agency to transfer what they need to look to. Also uploading, monitoring, downloading. You're trying to upload images to the cloud to do your photogrammetrics. You've got to have somebody upload them and make sure that they get uploaded, that it doesn't somehow cancel. And then you've got to download it. Oh, it's ready for us to download. Who forgot? So it actually takes a full-time person. In fact, we would look at, ideally, you would have somebody who worked day and a person who would work the night shift so that you could keep up with it. We quickly get inundated. We've never been to a disaster yet, even with dedicated data managers, that still the data didn't outstrip their abilities to keep up. So some recommendations for hurricane and flood events. We tell the responders to focus on first-person view and experts, that to think about the response phase as being all about the expert seeing at a distance. And also not to look at it as a reduction in manpower or a substitution for their experts, but as an amplifier and accelerator for their experts. And so this is something that we had already started doing with Fort Bend County. We had done this in Louisiana for their floods. You have the expert with the team, but you don't expect the expert to double as a pilot. You expect, and that also means you want to start having those displays, a mission specialist display, make it easy for them to see and annotate, not necessarily see little icons about the status of the UAV that they don't really care about, blocking their view overlaid on it. Also, but even though we want experts there, we can't expect streaming to work, especially if you're trying to maintain multiple teams covering a 20-mile radius. If you're thinking the responders are coming in and putting up their own local area networks, 20-mile radius, it gets much harder to support with the high bandwidth that you'd like. And this also means that you need to practice that pilot-expert coordination and what data to collect for what mission objective, rather than focusing on, here, we all need to get good at mapping. We probably need to do more about with the pilot, the human-robot interaction, and particularly with ad hoc teams, it becomes much more important. So recommendations for floods. Other ones also is, wow, maybe you don't need that long endurance or specialized sensors. I mean, I've gotten a lot of roboticists have come to me and said, oh, well, we definitely need a robot that has 45-minute duration to be effective in a disaster. We were seeing 9 to 12 minutes. $1,000 platform, a Mavic Pro, was sufficient for a flooding disaster. It was fine. And even better, $1,000. You'd hate to lose it, but if it lands in water, you know, and water and electricity doesn't, so you're not getting it back. That's way better than a $30,000 platform or a $70,000 platform. So this whole focus on long endurance and specialized sensors may make sense for some applications, but it's not making sense for hurricanes and floods based on what we've consistently seen since 2005. Also have to have a dedicated data manager, data management plan. Remember, as researchers, we forget there has to be a chain of custody. We also need archiving and curation, because now you're going to go back and look at that data. How does that happen? How do you ever find this again? And also, we're going to work with beyond line of sight. Well, no, what a big important lesson that got really honed at Harvey was, for us, the density of manned aircraft traffic was so high that it was not, even though it could have been legal to go beyond visual line of sight, it wasn't safe. We could not see well enough as that helicopter doing a medical evac was coming screaming through there to get out of the way. So we needed to keep eyes on the bird, and we needed to be low to keep it safe and simple and be a good citizen. Even though we were coordinating, Justin Adams, our lead, was coordinating manned and unmanned aircraft. We had software that was letting us see the transponders of all the manned aircraft, but even so, to be safe for that. So I would suggest that these are things for people who are designing platforms to consider, as well as software people to think about data management, the data informatics. And so this was, again, not terribly different than what we saw in Katrina with the very short focused flights. You think you're going to be flying a long time, but instead you're up and they see it and then they're done. Okay. And I think also this is why we refer to this workshop as evidence-based analysis and training, is that now that we've been doing this for 12 years, the community has been doing this 12 years. Now let's get the evidence out there. What are truly not just best practices, but quantitatively known to be best practices. So just in case you're interested, we have an online course for small unmanned aerial systems for emergency managers. If you're doing research in emergency management and disasters, you might want to take that because it gives kind of an overview. And then we have much more specialized courses on actually how to fly under these conditions, which are quite different than getting your, in the United States, a Part 107 or training from a manufacturer. There's a lot of differences there. All right, and that concludes the presentation portion of this, and I'm going to turn this back over.
All right, we're getting ready to get started here again. We did have a question come in that Dr. Murphy did answer in the chat on YouTube here, but it said, the question was, what do you see as the areas within rescue or disaster response where autonomous robot or automation assistive technology can contribute most to improving outcomes? And to add to Dr. Murphy's answer there, which I think was spot on. Honestly, I think it's going to be. I'm going to encourage everyone who's thinking about using robots in disasters is to don't overlook the simple stuff, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through the lessons learned here from ARMA and the findings in that data set. But oftentimes it is the very simple things that can provide some of the biggest value out of this technology. So as most of you are aware, right after Hurricane Harvey, we actually cut short our deployment to Fort Bend County by a day, so that the team here from Center for Disaster Risk Policy at FSU could get back to Tallahassee, because we have, in addition to the deployment we're going to talk about, we also have responsibilities in the State Emergency Operations Center and the Air Operations Branch there, which actually gives us a fairly unique view of how UAS integration is happening from a state level, and that we have people working as UAS coordinators in the Air Operations Branch, as well as deployed in the field. So let's see. All right, so let's walk through this timeline a little bit. And again, we did have some days in there where we spent some time in the State Emergency Operations Center. But let's look through the timeline that covers the data that we're going to be talking about, and it really runs from the 9th of September to the 15th of September. And the 9th and the 10th was spent pre-positioned. So our CDRP team is part of Florida Task Force 8, one of the state USAR assets. And so we pre-deployed on Saturday, 9 September, to the Florida State Fire College, which is located in Ocala. And Task Force 8 is based out of North Central Florida, covering Marion and Ocala and Alachua counties. And so the Fire College there is pretty much their home base. So we pre-positioned there and kind of rode the storm out there in anticipation that we would be activated as part of Task Force 8, which we were late on the 10th. On the 11th, on Monday, the 11th, we deployed to Putnam County. We operated there for a day, and then overnight, between the 11th and the 12th, we drove from Putnam County to Collier County, which was about a 6-hour drive. And then for the remainder of that week, the 12th and the 15th, we flew missions supporting Collier County and their critical infrastructure folks doing damage assessment and everything else. So, some of the big differences we had here is that we were not operating as local air operations, our county air operations, as Quasar did during the Harvey deployment. And so we were almost exclusively being used as UAS operators in the field. So that's a significant difference to start with. So let's look at some numbers for the Putnam County portion, our Task Force 8 part of the deployment, which lasted from the 9th to the 11th of September. We had 5 personnel, excuse me, 5 personnel and 9 aircraft with us in 2 ground vehicles. And the aircraft we had included the Mavic Pro, the 3DR Solo, Inspire 1, including thermal, the DJI Zenmuse XT camera, and 2 Parrot Disco FixedWings. And so we had a wide variety of aircraft available. Everything had a very specific reason to be there. The Mavic Pro had certainly become our workhorse the weeks before in Hurricane Harvey, and we expected it to continue in that role. And the Inspire 1, we had 2 of those, was present simply because it was our night-capable bird with strobes and FLIR. And the Parrot Disco as a fixed wing is an excellent initial reconnaissance bird, right? So actually referring back to what Dr. Murphy talked about in the IRMA discussion, there is that myth of that initial reconnaissance, let's pop a drone in the air and see what there is to see. And that that myth is kind of borne out with what we saw in the Putnam and the Collier County deployments. But we carry the Disco for that. It's an excellent bird for particularly for beach reconnaissance, anything long line. We get about 40 to 50 minutes of loiter time with that aircraft. But we didn't use it in Putnam County. So 2 ground vehicles, so allowed us to split up our 5 personnel and operate from 2 locations. And we were fully self-sustaining in regarding to fuel, food, water, shelter, etc. So for the Putnam County side, we were attached to and part of Florida USAR Task Force 8, specifically what they were calling their Bravo element. The Alpha element had been air deployed into the Keys. That was a small piece of it, and the remainder of the team was operating in North Florida. So the initial mission, as we have exercised with the task force, is to provide that reconnaissance, situational awareness, advanced mapping, though we didn't actually do any mapping for them, and overwatch of assets that are working on the ground. So we flew 5 sorties, all on 11 September, all of which utilized the Mavic Pro. So 11 September was post-landfall. Storm had moved through all of Florida. However, in Putnam County, we were still seeing sustained winds above 40 miles an hour and gusts up to 50. So it was definitely, it was an interesting time to be flying. So after we translated down to Collier County, or transited down there, we added on some initial resources. So obviously the first thing that got to Collier County was everything that had been part of Task Force 8, which included the 5 personnel, the aircraft, and the 2 ground vehicles. Our final personnel count was 8, and that included folks from Florida State University, Texas A&M, and Kovar and Associates from the private sector. We ended up having 4 ground vehicles, plus the Texas A&M mobile lab, which was a fantastic resource for us to have to manage missions, crews, and everything else. So we ended up deploying Quasar resources from Texas to supplement the FSU crews, and ultimately, though, we had, in addition to the aircraft that we had with us, I'm going to go back to that slide. The Matic Pro, the Solo, Inspire 1, and the Disco. In addition to those 9 aircraft, we added in a DJI M600 and additional Mavic Pros. We only utilized a single model of aircraft the entire time that we were in Collier County, and that was the Mavic Pro. And again, and Dr. Murphy already talked about this regarding it's relatively inexpensive, but it is easy to operate. And, in a lot of ways, it was viewed as, we view ours as disposable in a lot of ways. There's certainly not a barrier to replacing it financially, which, we don't want to ever get into situations where we're risking aircraft, but we are flying in post-disaster environments, or in the case of the USAR team, still on the tail end of the wind event. So, that makes you feel a little bit better about the whole thing. But the Mavic is an incredibly capable platform in daylight. We did not fly any nighttime sorties, so that was great. We ended up flying 155 sorties in both counties. We hit 500 critical infrastructure key resource targets in Collier County in 4 operational days. So I'm going to come back to that number, 155, in a minute, because it's actually one of the more important takeaways from this deployment. So mission types in both counties. We flew 12 situational awareness missions, 76 damage, debris, and flood estimation missions, and 66 inspection missions. And let's look at how that breaks out by day. So on September 11th, relatively low. That's when we were in Collier County, Putnam County. On the 12th, we began to get operational in Collier County, but we were still limited in our resources. We really were only able to operate a single team at a time because Quasar resources and additional CDRP FSU resources were still en route, in transit on the 12th. And they arrived evening of the 12th, and that allowed us for the next 3 days, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, as you can see here, to really step up the operational tempo and start pushing through. So the vast majority of our missions, and it's actually a fairly even split, is that debris, damage, flood estimation, and the inspection missions. And we classify these basically by what we were looking at on those imagery there. Another key takeaway as far as a difference between the Harvey and the Irma deployment is during Harvey, we had a county person with us all the time, right? So every team that deployed to the field, in some days that was as high as 4 or 5 teams in Fort Bend County, had a county representative with us, often in a marked vehicle. But they were able to interact with the citizenry as well as provide that technical expertise on what we were seeing. The ARMA deployment was very different. We would get our taskings in the morning at the county EOC, and they did not have resources to send with us. So our teams deployed to the field on their own, gathered data, and then we would return it back to the county EOC that evening, and then we would adjust and go from there. So that's a very different. It was definitely a very different feeling on the ground, and it really does change the way that data is analyzed and utilized, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But you can see that the operational tempo was increasing across the board. We got pretty efficient by the 15th. In how we were going to do route management and everything else. And again, we're going to come back to this slide in a little bit, and one of the findings that we talk about and look at this pacing again. So this is pretty much just the same information in a different view. So let's move to the next one. Flight time per day. This is what you'd expect. This is measured in minutes. And again, very short amount of times on the 11th and the 12th, and then it does start to jump up there on the 13th, 14th, and 15th. However, I do want to point out one key piece here. When I said we were getting efficient by the 15th, if you'll note here, we flew 165 minutes total on the 15th, but we flew the highest number of missions, almost 70 missions, 67 missions that day. So our time per mission was going down. So we had definitely hit our stride by the 15th, but at the same time, not to skip ahead too hard, we were wearing out. That operational tempo is hard to maintain for any period of time. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So we only collected, in comparison to Harvey, we collected 52.6 gigabytes of data. And unlike Harvey, where we had a specific data type that was requested, some of these missions, a very few, mixed both still imagery in the debris, flood, and damage estimation, as well as the inspection, mixed still imagery and video files. But we did not, as you can see here, we did not shoot a lot of video. We shot 4,259 still images and 75 video files. That's it. So only 1.8% of our files are video, which actually explains a lot why our data size is so much lower compared to Harvey at only 52.6, because we were being tasked by Collier County, to capture damage assessment information. And at the same time, we were being asked to upload that information to FEMA Region 4 using the FEMA CAP image uploader, which means, and we were well aware this was going to happen ahead of time, first of all, the FEMA CAP image uploader doesn't accept video files. So all we can send to FEMA is still imagery. And at the same time, geolocating video files is a complex process. So the GIS experts at Collier County were not all that interested in getting a lot of video imagery. They were much more interested in getting geo-rectified orthomosaics as well as geolocated still images. So, it was pretty much a deliberate choice to not shoot as much video and shoot considerably more still imagery, because that is what the clients or the consumers of the information were able to deal with. So, one thing that does tie to is we were being very conscious about limiting the amount of data we were capturing in the field, because, as I'll talk about later, we had some significant communications infrastructure issues that were going to make it difficult to move all of that information around. So, I told you I'd come back to that 155 number. So for a long time, months actually, we had written down that we flew 247 sorties. Turns out it was only 155. And a lot of that comes from the fact that I apparently cannot interpret my own chicken scratch. And we did a very poor job during that week as we were managing missions of tracking by writing down how many sorties we'd flown. And only when we go back and look at the imagery collected and the logs from the aircraft, we were able to get a more accurate number. And I can't stress this enough, and we experienced this in Harvey, we've experienced it in Irma, we experienced it in Hawaii 2 weeks ago. Just about every time I have gone to the field in either a full-scale exercise or an actual event, managing the missions and then the associated data that goes with those missions is probably the most difficult aspect of any of these deployments. And by difficult, I mean it is time consuming. You need people that are dedicated to it. You need an effective system to make that work. And you can't go out and buy a software package that's going to do that for you. And we've tried it in a variety of different ways. We've done, we'll keep the records digitally. We've used easel boards, we've used whiteboards, we've used spreadsheets, we've used databases, we use GIS systems. We've tried a variety of different ways to do this. And the only thing that is in common of all of it is it's very difficult. And if you take your eye off that task, if you don't have someone dedicated to it, you are going to get something wrong or you're going to lose data. And the simplest explanation is, you're going to miscount the amount of sorties that you flew in a relatively short period of time. That was in a 4-day period. So those discrepancies and errors will happen. You certainly don't want to get in a situation like Dr. Murphy talked about this before, where you lose data, or you overwrite data, or you're capturing data in a way that doesn't make sense. And we're going to try to circle back around to that here in a few minutes. All right, so shifting from the stories the data tells to kind of the findings from the deployment itself on some of the lessons learned. First of all, we did not have enough UAS resources in the state of Florida. Nowhere close, right? And so again, shifting from Harvey to Irma. In Harvey, we were focused exclusively on Fort Bend County. Quasar ran, Justin Adams ran air operations for the county, as well as led, the UAS team. And so we had a very good visibility on what was happening in the county, that included both manned and unmanned aircraft. In Florida, we started out with pretty good visibility because we moved from the State Emergency Operations Center straight into a deployed role, and we actually had staff in the state EOC, including Laura, who was on the webinar earlier, working in air operations. So we had a direct line. We understood what was happening. And the one thing that was becoming clear is that there were way more requests for UAS support coming out of the counties than there were resources available. And the few resources that we knew about, or that I knew about, they were not typed. So, and typing, for those of you who are not emergency managers, resource typing is how FEMA and the states track what capabilities specific resources have, and it's designed in such a way that it's supposed to cut down on any confusion of when a resource is requested and shows up, what exactly is that resource going to be able to accomplish for the incident commanders. So, typing does not exist for UAS, though I understand we'll see draft typing from the FEMA level come out this month in a couple of weeks. So, we're moving in that direction. So, back to what I was saying, there weren't enough resources available in Florida, and I wasn't necessarily certain about the ones that were here, what they could accomplish. And the best illustration for that is on the 11th of September, when it got dark in Putnam County, the assumption was that TF-8 would be demobilized and sent home. So they were going to spend the night in Putnam County and then demobilize the next morning and return back to their home bases in north central Florida. It was at that point that we were requested to go to Collier County, because the assumption was the UAS resource, the CDRP team, was no longer going to be needed as part of Task Force 8, and there was other work for us to do. So that is why we were separated from TF-8 and transited to Collier County and went to work down there. However, I got a phone call on the afternoon of the 12th from the task force leader in Collier County asking, "Hey, are you guys still nearby?" Because it turns out they hadn't been demobilized. They had been redeployed out along the St. Johns River, where there were thousands of homes being flooded, and they were going door to door. And again, a UAS would have certainly been of value to them there. So, and I unfortunately had to tell them that we were already fully committed and we were 6 hours away. And frankly, I wasn't convinced there was enough gasoline between Collier County and Putnam County to get my team back up there. And then I was unable to find additional resources for them, right? So finally, we did get a team out of Alachua County that was able to help them some, but that was an unmet need. There was an unmet need in Okeechobee County. There were unmet needs in Hillsborough County. These resources don't exist, and the ones that do exist, we didn't know about, and there was no way to coordinate them, no way to even reach them, right? So we were depending upon personal networks of who do we know to locate resources and see what their availability was, because we did not have any type of formal coordination network. UAS resources don't appear in any mutual aid database or anything else. So, and this problem persists now, right? You're seeing this on the Big Island of Hawaii currently, where incoming UAS resources, no one knows what they're capable of. No one knows what can be requested. No one knows what resources are nearby. So this is a problem that we're going to have to solve as we continue to integrate unmanned aircraft and robots into response and recovery. All right. Harvey was a flood event for Fort Bend County. And that meant that while there was a lot of flooding, there was not a lot of wind damage. And the cellular networks were, for the most part, intact and functional. That was certainly not the case in Collier County. Cellular networks had been severely degraded by either wind damage to towers or power interruptions to towers, and then subsequent failure of battery and generator backups. So towers were going offline. So when you got inland into the more rural parts of Collier County, there was no network connectivity at all. There was no cell connection. There was nothing. At the same time, we had significant issues with communications because the county radio cache had already been fully allocated. So by the time that we got to the county and deployed, there were no handheld radios available for us. So in effect, the only coordination we could do amongst our command and control element and our teams was to basically task them in the morning, send them out on the road to do what they needed to do, and then we would not necessarily talk to them again until the evening when they returned back to Mobile Lab or Naples Airport. So that communications challenge was huge, but it also presented an immediate challenge when it came to data management. We had teams had no way to move data back to us at the EOC or in the in Mobile Lab. There was no connectivity to make that happen, which means the only way we were able to deliver data to the county EOC was manually, physically, using an external drive every night. So once all teams had returned and we recovered all data from them, backed it up locally, we then took an external hard drive and drove that to the County Emergency Operations Center, where we handed that data over. So at the same time, we were getting point of information or point of interest lists or targeting lists from the county infrastructure folks. Effectively, we were given a GIS layer that included all of their critical infrastructure and key resources. So that included all power generation and substations, water and wastewater treatment facilities, schools, fire stations, transfer stations, communications nodes for that were publicly owned by the county, hospitals, shelters, just a huge list. It was almost 1,100 individual targets. Now that sounds bad, but if you get to one water treatment plant and every pump house is labeled, you'd find that there might be 40 or 50 targets within 100 meters of each other. So that took a little while to figure out, but it was difficult to manage. It was a big unwieldy list, and it made prioritization difficult. Right, a lot of the data in that list was old, was inaccurate, or was not categorized at all, which made it very difficult when they said, we want to prioritize schools and shelters. We then had to manually go through a lot of that list and figure out what was a school or a shelter, because the categorization wasn't always accurate there. So that was definitely a challenge. It slowed us down. And honestly, if we go back to let me go back a few slides here. Go back to this slide that shows our emission rates per day. We got a lot better, not only because of we were kind of in the groove, if you will, but also because that data management, we got a lot better at it as the week went on. So by the time we got to Friday, we had an effective system to manage kind of that unwieldy list, break it up effectively, and send teams out with a much larger list area in a certain area that they could cover. So, and that kind of ties into our next finding there, where we lacked a solid GIS workflow, right? So for better or for worse, we all deploy with MacBooks. Macs don't run ArcGIS. So we're running open source QGIS, which is fine. It's a great product. But there's certainly a learning curve there on how we're going to manage this incoming data, which is coming out of an ArcGIS server layer. How are we going to filter this? And again, that kind of ties back to that previous point and demonstrates how we got better at that as the week went on, and therefore our sortie rates per day really started to go up. All right, so the data we provided to the county infrastructure officials was extremely useful to them. However, you have to, as part of the team, create information from the data. You cannot necessarily just dump, you know, here's 1,000 still images, and yeah, they're geolocated, and if you wanted to process that and drone the map and get yourself a shape file or a KML out of that, knock yourself out. No one's got time for that. There is never anyone in a disaster, and this was true in Harvey and Irma, at the local, the state level, nobody is sitting around with extra time on their hands. And that's particularly true of the GIS people, of the infrastructure folks, of the people who can really make use of this data. So that transformation from data to information has to occur in the UAS team itself. You have to be able to take the raw data off the aircraft, process that into something useful, and then hand off useful, actionable information. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you're going to bring a external drive full of 1,000 images into an EOC. They're going to say thank you. They're going to copy it off to their network drive. They're going to hand you your drive back, and they are never going to look at that data again. If you don't make useful information, if you don't coordinate with the EOC about what it is they're trying to accomplish and how can you then build products out of the raw data being captured by the UAS that supports whatever it is they're trying to do, you probably are just more in the way. Now that's if we're talking about, working with the GIS folks, critical infrastructure, things like that. Because let's take a step back and look at what the team accomplished with Task Force 8 in Putnam County. We only flew 5 sorties. Every one of those, however, was a video mission. It was first-person view, and we did not really create anything from that because the biggest takeaway was we would hand an external monitor to the task force leader who could then make immediate decisions on the ground about how he was going to prioritize resources. All right. How he was going, which houses he was worried about, which streets he was worried about, where he was going to send the people on the ground. So there was no processing required. So that information that we're creating is just the ability to hand a live video to a task force leader and let them make tactical decisions on what do I need to worry about first, what do I need to worry about second. All right. So, if we can help an existing ground resource make effective use of limited resources, right? We had 27 people in Task Force 8 Bravo on the ground to cover 100 houses on the 11th. So the ability to look at that house and say that house is not wet. There's no rising water in that house. Yes, there's water in the road, but the house is not wet means we can move on to something else where someone might actually be trapped and actually put our limited resources to much more effective use. So that simple thing, that simple product of handing off a live video feed is oftentimes some of the most effective things that we could do. All right. Airspace coordination was, for the most part, effective. The State Air Operations Branch had set up an airspace management plan statewide, broken that into 4 divisions, northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. And there was an associated comm plan or communications plan that went with each division so that all aircraft, manned and unmanned in those areas, knew what altitudes they could operate at, knew who to talk to coordinate their activities with. It had VHF and UHF channels to monitor so we understood what everybody in the airspace was doing. Sounded great, worked great for the most part. However, that second part of this finding is that a lot of the Title 10 resources, and Title 10 resources are active duty military, Department of Defense resources such as Navy helos, Marine Corps aircraft, active duty Air Force. They never got the state's airspace management plan, nor did they get the comm plan. So they were operating on service authority or tasked by federal authorities into areas like Collier County in the coastal areas down there. So they're there and they're operating at 200 feet, 300 feet, and don't know how to talk to everybody on the ground. So, that caused us some issues. And, honestly, you just fall back to see and avoid and give way to manned aircraft. So that's what we did. We kind of held back, waited for them to clear the area, and then continued on with the mission there. But that's definitely something we want to keep in mind moving forward. One of my last points I want to make is, and I think hopefully that theme has been clear throughout this entire little presentation piece here, there is much more to this than just pilots. And I know Dr. Murphy made this point as well with the Harvey lessons learned. You've got to have more than just pilots. Flying is the easy part. I tell people that all the time. But we've got to have personnel on the ground capable of performing tasks besides piloting, including that data management piece. And I will never stress this enough, right? And I think we all got tired of hearing it in past deployments, but it is very true. If you don't do this well, you are wasting your time. So that data management piece is key. What information are we collecting? Where is it coming from? What mission is it assigned to? Who needs the data? What products do we have to build out of this? All falls onto that data management piece. And you pretty much need to dedicate 1 or 2 people that never touch a UAS to do this mission, particularly on these large, long deployments. Creating information from data, you've got to be able to build those ortho-rectified mosaics yourself. You've got to be able to know how to process using FLIR tools and everything else, so that you're not just handing off that raw data and saying, have fun, guys, we're going to go get some dinner. You've got to spend the time to create that information, because remember, the overall goal is to help the incident command structure, deal with this disaster, not just, dump useless photos on them. You need people to help plan the next day's missions, and that's something we haven't had ever. In a perfect world now in a deployment, we would have an overnight team, an overhead team that could actually sit there after the flight teams are done, after all that information is delivered and created, and plan out the next day, so that when flight teams got up, when the sun came up, they could be handed a mission packet for what they need to go accomplish during the daylight hours, and they could go do that. As it was in both Harvey and Irma, we were scrambling at 6 o'clock in the morning to plan what the teams were going to be accomplishing in the field, and that often takes an hour, hour and a half, and that's valuable time. That's literally burning daylight. So we have to have people that are capable of doing that, and then just the logistics and support. And that's not just for the aircraft, but that's for the people too, right? In Irma, we were staying in a hangar on the Naples airport. It was donated to us. Empty hangar, no power, no water, no nothing. So, just the simple logistics of we had fuel, we had food, we had water, but resupply that water. A porta potty would be great. All of that, going off to refuel vehicles, because we were driving all over. So just have people to handle that is important. So all of this is beyond just the pilots. And yes, you can multitask some, but not always. All right, so that is what I have talking about the Irma deployment. I think I'm still a few minutes early on the agenda. Oh, we see a question coming in right now. What was the average flight time? Flight times depended on, average under 8 minutes. So we actually had very short flight times, particularly as we started to get into the rhythm of that damage assessment. The day often devolved into drive to a GPS point, get out of the vehicle, and launch a mission, fly 5-6 minutes, land, drive to the next location, rinse and repeat. So flight times were ultimately very, very short. Earlier in the week, flight times were longer, still well within the capacity of the Mavic, but we were seeing flight times of 16, 17 minutes on Monday and Tuesday on those longer flights. And of course, on the mapping missions, we see much longer flights, because usually each of those missions required multiple sorties. So we were trying to push up to the higher limits there of 19 or 20 minutes. But the damage assessment flights do show 6 to 7 minutes, very, very short. And that was actually we did some things that we had not done before. We were able to fly maybe 2 or 3 sites, 2 or 3 CIKR sites with a single battery. So we'd land, drive 10 minutes, launch, and fly again.
Okay, we've got some questions here. They're kind of general. So let's see the first one. What are the needs of the rescue stakeholders that are not being addressed by the research community? For me, I think that the data continues. I mean, since 2001 and through this data set continues to emphasize it's the data decision process that everybody I know and is working on the robotic side, not about the snippeting, delivery, distribution, how this is going to be done part. Or, and when they do mission plans, like, well, if you told me everything, I can do an optimal plan for you each night. It's like, yeah, except that they change it about 15 minutes into the morning with there. So what I'm seeing is more of too much of a focus on the robot and not enough focus on the work domain and how to support that. And in part of the work domain, as well as planning and the resource allocation, that's not a static or fixed allocation. David, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that covers it pretty well. I mean, honestly, it does come down to not necessarily the robot anymore, or less importance on development of the robot, and more importance on the data side that supports it, and how do we manage those missions? How do we deliver that data effectively? Which is another interesting thing. I mean, we had some, I think, really good success with FirstNet in the field. That might be something here in the U.S. that helps us deliver that data effectively, but we still have a long way to go there.
All right, we'll go to the next question. Are there any available technologies you choose not to use or conduct research on, and why? From my personal research, what we do here at A&M and the Humanitarian Robotics and AI Laboratory is that we focus on primarily physically situated artificial intelligence. And there's nothing in that area we exclude. We tend to concentrate on the human-robot aspects and the cognitive work domain analysis to identify what are the AI capabilities or the advances in AI that would be most useful. And also what are the gaps in current level of AI that could be there. But I'm not really, there's nothing I refuse to work with, like I don't like those sensors, therefore I shall not work with them. David, do you have any thoughts?
I don't have anything that I deliberately don't work with. I think we have spent a lot of time here at CDRP and FSU looking at how we can bring, specifically the UAS capacity to more rural counties, areas that may not have such a significant budget, certainly can't afford a lot of manned aviation. So because of that initial focus, and that goes back to 2012 and 2013, we have focused a lot on commercial off-the-shelf solutions, such as things from 3DR and DJI, of course. So we don't do a lot of research into the more expensive, platforms that came out of the Department of Defense and things like that, because first of all, we don't necessarily have the budget to do that, and second of all, the counties that we work with, the initial stakeholders here in Florida, with few exceptions, no one's got a budget to put those things to work. So even if we proved, a significant increase in capability, which I'm not convinced is there, but even if we did do that, it's not like the emergency managers in most of the counties in Florida would be able to go off and put that stuff to work. So we do tend to avoid that. But again, that's more of a practicality decision than it is any type of technical or ideological reason for not researching something.
And I'm going to go back to that. I realize there is something I don't do, and that is if I get somebody who says, oh, we're going to do a centralized control system, and we're going to coordinate all the robots from one single, command post or something. And I'm like, yeah, sure. No, I'm not interested in that solution. It's going to always, for me, I don't see that as the future, because emergency response is not a military hierarchical system. There's what, between 14 and 17 emergency support functions at a disaster, depending on what state you're in and what type of disaster. So these agencies all bring in their resources. They all bring in slightly different things. The idea that they're all going to be using the same Apple phone, no, they're probably not. Somebody's going to have an Android phone, and somebody might even have a Microsoft phone still floating around. So it's more this idea of focusing on this one program that's going to coordinate everything. No, it's not. And I think David Woods at Ohio State, a cognitive engineer, really looked at it and was out with us with our summer institutes and said, this is the classic polycentric system where there are multiple groups trying to independently use the same resources or the same type of resource, but independently, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. They don't even know the other ones exist. And the trick is, how do you enable those groups who didn't even know the other one needed the data to be able to share and access and get things? So that highly distributed, loosely coupled system is much more interesting to me than trying to say, well, everything will come through a centralized controller, and there'll only be this type of robot and only this type of aerial vehicle and this type of water robot and this, and all be trained. I just don't see it happening. I find that a much easier solution, but it was not going to happen. And I like the challenge of, what do you do with this just-in-time ad hoc teaming? How do you handle that? So that is something I don't look into. Okay, let's go to the next question then. Are the stakeholders you work with willing to try new technology in a rescue scenario? What criteria would some piece of technology need to satisfy before they would use it in a critical situation? Okay, let me say this time and time again. You don't try out new stuff. As academics, what we consider new stuff, we can't try that in a disaster. That's unethical because we cannot make the disaster worse. So the idea of a new technology might be like when we went to Hawaii and we took in a new radiometric thermal sensor, but it's a commercial system that's been used by other agencies. So if you're familiar with NASA's technical readiness levels, what we're talking about is technical readiness level at an 8. 9's the highest. It says, yes, it's been used forever in the space program. Level 8 says it's been used forever in some other application that's really similar, just never for the space program. So it's essentially the same thing we're looking here. If you don't have something that's at level 8, something that's been proven to be used someplace else, and thus is extremely unlikely to just fail on its own. I mean, because there's so many other ways putting an existing technology in a new application can fail, then it's unethical to bring that out. So we don't bring out new technology. And you may have met new technology in a different way. So I apologize for that if I got off base there. And what was the rest? And the responders are the first to say no. The responders are typically, because they are publicly accountable. So if anything crazy goes wrong because they had a bunch of crazy scientists doing stuff with them, I mean, how would you explain that to the public? That you've managed to make things worse by letting people who've just barely gotten out of the lab, there. So I think that's a problem. So what criteria would some new piece of technology need to satisfy? So there is, I'm going to let David talk about the standards efforts that are going on. That is not a clear thing. I mean, we've got groups like NIST that are like, oh, well, we just show that this robot can be used over and over again so many times, but they don't consider the operator or the conditions under which it is or the full system use. And then you've got criteria like, oh, we're going to test to see if the person is qualified and has so many hours of use on it. David, what do you see with the criteria, and what in the different, what the council is working on that too, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of entities working on standardization and typing, including NFPA. Will have Technical Center 2400 come out, I believe. It might be late 2018, 2019, early before we see that. But that's probably the best effort that I've seen so far, because it does apply to both the operator as well as the organization. You know, and that's important. You know, I mean, Crazar is a unique organization. We're fairly virtual. We're split up. You know, I mean, Dr. Murphy's in Texas and I'm in Florida. But there's not a lot of organizations that have the reach that we do, and a few others do, and very few of those have any type of standardization in place for what their operator requirements are, their crew requirements are, what their maintenance cycles should look like. You know, what is the standardized risk management from a flight-to-flight basis? You know, do you fly? Do you not fly? Who makes that decision? Who's authorized to make that decision? You know, so those standards don't exist in a lot of places, and I am happy to see that NFPA is moving that route. ATSM or ASTM, yeah, they have a standard coming on technical search for search and rescue, but again, that's going to be focused on the aircraft, and of course, NIST has done a lot of work, and I'm looking forward to see what FEMA comes up with in the final pass at their effort for typing UAS teams. You know, that's something we're working on here in Florida internally, because typing leads to mutual aid. You know, once we have teams typed, then we can request them effectively through existing systems, ensure reimbursement and things like that. So standardization is something that we really need to see more of, and not just for the pilot, but for teams and for parent organizations, how they work together so that we can, you know, so that interoperability is there as well. I mean, this is something we see all the time. You know, we'll show up and fly, and a different team, which might have the same equipment, has a different focus and actually a different set of capabilities, what they can and can't do. Can't fly at night, or are focused on mapping and not necessarily on the emergency management side, or can only do live video, things like that. So, you know, we'll get there. It is interesting though, because you know, Robin's been doing this since forever, it seems. You know, 2005 flew in Katrina, and we're still in a lot of ways in this infant stage of trying to figure out exactly how to integrate it all. Which I think everyone expected to see it a little farther along at this point. But I'm happy to see that a lot of these major organizations are making moves in that direction.
Yeah, and you know, I thought about maybe the question was really asking how did they select platforms, and you know, we've done a little bit on advising them on how to kick the tires of that. You know, you've got a commercial platform, but some are like, oh, this is a super military one. One of the quickest criteria I tell them to use is yeah, all these robots are all commercially available. They've been used by the military or by commercial videographers. What about the batteries? Can you take this on a plane? Because if you can't take it on a plane, it's probably got very specialized high density batteries, which means it's still new and flaky and expensive. Okay, more than that's one of the advantages of the Mavic. I mean, you just take that on the plane, you don't have to worry about it. Now that said, we've got the 600 and the 210 series, which were really hard to get to Hawaii because they have these high density batteries. But that is also, those systems are also affordable versus the $70,000 systems that we're seeing. Oh, we need to make a very specialized UAV for disasters, and it needs this kind of endurance, and it needs this. And it's like, no, maybe not. You got to be able to do it. Also, those bigger batteries, how are you going to recharge the batteries in the field? You know, a Mavic battery, you're using an inverter off your car. You know, one of these bigger systems, you're all of a sudden, now you got to take a generator. You've got to carry that around. You got to carry the gas for the generator. You got to deal with the smell of the gas in the generator as you travel 20 miles between sites and things. So it gets kind of interesting to see. So there's some practical limitations on there. We also suggest it's like, look, how are you going to see the data? What's the streaming look like? Does it give you ability to have a replicated monitor, or even better, you just see the video as the expert rather than seeing all the little icons about the status of the platform, which you don't care about, and always seem to appear to be superimposed over what you're looking at. Those are some of the things to look at. So does anybody have any questions about or suggestions about the website, or about what data we should collect? I mean, the idea of collecting the flight paths and all the internal state of the UAV would be nice, but that's kind of a manufacturer's limitation for us. Likewise, it can be very hard to get useful human factors data there during a disaster. The physiological measures, fortunately, those are coming, like the wearable wristwatches are getting a little less bulky. But when you're wearing respirators and physical gear, it gets kind of intrusive. And so it's very hard to instrument people to do that. I read something about NASA, and they said basically the reason why they were able to get such fantastic human factors and physiological data for astronauts is that all of the candidates were so desperate, so motivated to be an astronaut who got to fly in space that they would do anything, literally. And the fire rescue teams, not so much, right? Not so much. David, do you have anything to say?
Not really, except that I did not care for wearing the watch. Just leave it at that. So.
And that, so David's referring to in the Leilani Gardens eruption event, we were all wearing a biometric watch. Now, we already have our own watches, but you have to wear it on the dominant hand. Some of us wear our watch on that hand, and now you've got more stuff going over, and it's kind of hot. And we're already talking about working at a site where you've got a physiological and psychological deficit going because of lack of sleep and the nature of being an event, and you're wearing PPE. It just, even something is like, well, it's just a watch. I mean, it's kind of like a Fitbit, just a watch. And it's like, yeah, well, it's a pain.